Chapter 3. A Meeting. The boys had to run to make it back to the house in time. Mr. Jinx and Mr. Flute were both standing on the porch when they got there. "Hello, sirs," Tom said. "Sorry we were almost late." He dropped his backpack at their feet as Garrison and Herc slipped past the men and into the orphanage. "Hello, Tom," Mr. Flute said. He smiled. Mr. Jinx didn't say anything, and he didn't smile. He just stared at Tom, waiting. Tom dropped to one knee and unzipped his bag. "I have my final report right here," he said. He found the thick bound report and pulled it out. Then he handed it to Mr. Flute. "Thank you, Tom," Mr. Flute said, grinning. "So," Tom said, "if that's the final report, I guess the mission is about to really get started, huh?" Mr. Flute, still smiling, looked at Mr. Jinx. Mr. Jinx looked back, closed his eyes briefly, and shook his head. "Well," Mr. Flute said to Tom, "we will see. First, join Mr. Jinx and me in the meeting room with the rest of the children. We have something very important to discuss." Tom was surprised. They usually had meetings only when a new orphan arrived. But Mr. Jinx and Mr. Flute hadn't left the old orphanage in weeks. There were no new orphans. The two men turned and went inside the house. Tom hurried to zip up his backpack. Then he ran through the front door and started down the hall toward the meeting room. When he remembered that he'd left the front door open, he quickly ran back to close it. When Tom finally got to the meeting room and found a seat, he was out of breath. He was also the last orphan to get to the meeting. Mr. Flute smiled at him when he sat down. Mr. Jinx did not. "Hello," Mr. Flute said to the gathered orphans. "As some of you have guessed, our mission is about to move into its final stage." The orphans smiled and whispered to each other things like, "Finally, here we go, and it's gonna be so cool." But then Mr. Jinx cleared his throat. The room hushed. Everyone sat bolt upright in their chairs. Mr. Jinx never spoke, and he almost never made a sound. Mr. Jinx coughed. A girl in the back, one of the newest orphans, burst into tears as soon as she heard the sound. Now, Mr. Flute said, smiling. He put up his hands to calm the orphans. "Mr. Jinx, let's not get too angry. This will all be settled." Mr. Jinx crossed his arms. He stared at the far wall. "Thank you," Mr. Flute said. He turned back to the orphans. He sighed, still smiling, and pulled a chair from the corner. He sat down and leaned toward the children. "Orphans," he said, "I'm afraid this is a serious matter." He sounded sad and worried. Still, his smile was big and bright. He showed all his teeth when he smiled. Tom thought it made Mr. Flute seem a little scary sometimes, like when something serious was going on. "As you know, a fleet of ships from the homeworld is due to arrive very soon," Mr. Flute went on. "However, the ships are waiting just outside the solar system because their sensors have discovered something disturbing." Mr. Jinx coughed again. Several orphans flinched in their chairs. During one of their routine scans, Mr. Flute said, the ships detected an Earthling. The orphans leaned forward. They looked at one another. So what? Tom thought. Obviously, Earth is covered with Earthlings. Mr. Jinx sniffled and sneezed. The Earthling is living here, Mr. Flute said, in the orphanage. Mr. Jinx stamped his brightly colored boots on the meeting floor. He balled up his fists. He coughed and gritted his teeth. We have a spy, Mr. Flute said. A spy living among us. A little boy screamed. Chapter